Hello everyone, welcome to the course Disability Studies in India, Historical, Social and Cultural Perspectives, right? So in this module, I am talking about social policies, education and disability. In this lecture, I will be very focused on education and disability in India, right? So what I did in the previous two lectures, I tried to cover up, I tried to discuss that what are the important areas, what are the important places where we are working, right? Let's say, for example, I talked about social securities, right? Social security is one of the important significant steps that we have. Second, I talked about education, right? We talked about employment, we talked about health. And then I proceeded to talk about how to implement, right? How to implement that. What are the problem we have in thinking that how to implement. So I talked about both challenges and also pathways, right? Challenges means when you are going to implement, what are the challenges that you may face? And pathways means what are the direction that you can get, how you can proceed, how you can see that these are the problems going to crop up, right? And also I talked about certain policies, certain acts, 1995 Act, if you remember, I talked about it, right? 1995 Act that we discussed. Then we discussed 2015 Act. We discussed UNCPRD Act, how it was ratified by India, how it was, it asked people to think and policies to be mandated. An important thing also, we saw that how types of disability increase from 7 to 21, where cognitive disability became one of the important steps, right? Cognitive disability, because muscular dystrophy and other impairment was not taken into the consideration before, right? Was not taken into the point. So we have to think about this. We have to do research, proper research, to understand how is it moving, how the disability is evolving, what are the key areas where we can focus, where we can work. All right, so look at the slide number 1, please. In the slide number 1, I am talking about education, right? Education is a fundamental right and powerful tool for individual and societal advancement. Education is a fundamental right and a powerful tool for individual and social advancement. For individuals with disabilities, access to quality education remain a complex issue marked by systematic barrier and social stigma. In India, we are over 26 million, right? 26 million people are living with disabilities, right? That is what I am talking about, 2.21%, but understand this is the old data. This is the old data, not a new. We have to figure out right now what is the new. The landscape of education for students with disabilities has been gradual improvement over the years. Yet significant challenges remain. These include lack of physical accessibility, inadequate resources, limited awareness, and biases, right, that restrict the opportunities for individuals with disability to fully benefit from education, right, to fully benefit from education. So therefore, we are going to examine here the historical and current state of education for people with disabilities in India, recent legislative effort, challenges, potential solution to ensure inclusive education and equitable opportunities for all. So if you see that this entire lecture is going to focus only and only on education, for a reason that education is one important step from where we can change a lot of things, they can be included, they can be part of society, their voices can be heard, their contribution can be acknowledged. All right. So, these are important concern we need to discuss, we need to talk about. All right. So, look at the slide please. Historically, India's education system was not structured to accommodate students with disability. In traditional Indian society, social norms often excluded people with disabilities from mainstream social and educational spheres. While some information community-based support system existed, they lacked the capacity to provide adequate educational services to those with special needs. After India gained independence in 1947, the need for more inclusive approach to education gradually became evident. Though it took several decades for formal measures to begin addressing these issues. All right. Let me talk in brief historically how education developed. And that's I wish I could teach you entire history how education developed in India. Formally, I'm talking about, right? But obviously, it will take a lot of time. It will take a lot of lectures. But our lecture is not on history of education in India. Our lecture is about how education is important concern for people with disabilities in India. So, the first and foremost, when I'm saying education, we are not referring to formal education. Sorry, we are referring to formal education. It's not that India were not educated, there were not education system in India. There were education system, but the kind of education system we are talking today is different one. For example, if you go back and you see that people were already indulged in philosophy, let me talk about the Nalanda Vishwavidyalaya and all, where it was established much before, I am telling you this, and only those who were interested, they used to go, and it was more for developing your thinking, to make you argumentative, right? You can refer this book, this is a very important, right? Let me write the name for you on the slide and you can note it down, right? Argumentative Indian by Amartya Sen. So, this is the book I would suggest you that you please read this book. This is a very significant book because it's talking about how India was so dialogic, believed in arguments, discussion, debate, and most importantly, dissent. People were not having a problem if you have a disagreement, if you are challenging someone. They love to get the challenges and indulging in discussion. So, we have those universities where people were getting education, people were employed in education and they were enjoying the education facilities and so on and so forth. But it was, as I said, there was no such as entrance exam, there was no as such getting the certificates. It was there just so that you want to enhance your knowledge about life, about the world, about the philosophy, art, literature, whatever you want. You go there, you do this. I'm not very much sure about how many, like obviously science did not exist at the point of time. When I'm saying science, modern science, like department like geology, botany, so on and so forth. So, this is a matter of different discussion that what were discussed, what were not discussed, but I'm talking about that there was education system in India as well, but obviously due to the Britishers when they came to India, they challenged the entire education system. So, for example, Macaulay's Minute, where it is very clearly mentioned, right, in Macaulay's Minute, that one has to be Indian in terms of only blood and color, but English in taste, morality and in intellect, right? And obviously, Britishers demolished, not demolished, but obviously in one form culturally demolished the entire countries and brought their own way of thinking, their own way of looking at the education system of India. So, they changed everything from top to down, top to bottom, everything was changed. Alright, so having said this, so people with disability were very much part of the education system. They were getting education because education was not so tightly formalized, right? You can get education from your grandfather, grandmother, your neighbors, your nearby people, right? So you don't have to go to a certain buildings and then you can avail only that. So people were included, people were participating in workforce and on and all forth. But slowly and gradually, Britishers changed the entire education system and then they brought this up, which you can see now. And this education system was so rigid that obviously it was not possible without discriminating certain people, certain form of disabilities, right? So later on, now we are making an humble attempt so that people with disabilities can be included, so that they can be part of the society. You got this idea? So this is important, this is significant to understand this. So this is what I wanted to say, like when you are, I can give you a project task, just see how people with disabilities were included historically in India, right? What was their status before, what was their status now, and how their future status is being envisioned in coming times. You got this? Let's look at the next slide now. So the first substantial effort came with the national policies on education in 1996, which recognized the need to integrate children with disabilities into the mainstream education system. However, these policies lacked clear implementation strategies. The person with disabilities, equal opportunities, protection of rights and full participation, that Act passed in 1995. This marked a significant step forward by mandating that children with disabilities have access to education and vocational training. Yet, limited awareness and infrastructural inadequacies hindered its effectiveness. Right? So, what I am talking about, look at the first national education policies coming into 1986, where there is an attempt to integrate people with disabilities, right? And obviously that was led by 1995, the act that was passed. Recent years have seen more robust legislative initiative aimed at creating an inclusive education system for people with disabilities. Let's say the right of children to free and compulsory education, RTE, which was in 2009, which was a landmark in ensuring that every child aged 6 to 14 years has access to free and compulsory education, right? So it initially overlooked the needs of children with disability. So the 2012 amendment expanded its scope to explicitly include them, right? So this RTE is very significant. Right to education, that was passed in 2009, right? Right to education. What are they talking about in the right to education? Obviously, they are talking about free and compulsory, two things. That's why it's important, right? Remember this, one has to read very carefully. Free means no economic barriers. People will be allowed to go and study. They don't have to give money. I'm not talking about private institutions, okay? There are institutions available, right? And now you see Manrega is there. Also, you see there are people, students are getting food, so on and so forth. We'll talk about it. And compulsory, which means if I can go to the court and say that this family is not following RTE Act and not allowing their children to go to study in schools, I am telling you action will be taken. But what government failed to realize at that point of time? Obviously, this act was great, nice, wonderful. But in India, child have been working since since very beginning. Like they help the family members in some way or other ways. Because India was initially, even today, predominantly agricultural economy. So where people, families work in agriculture setup. So children do lot of small things and which help elders to take care of their family, right? To generate the economy for the family. But if they start sending children to the schools, who will help them? They cannot afford the labor because they don't have enough money. So I'm not talking about child labor. I'm talking about helping. This is This is a way through which India was criticized that child labor. People are child are involved in the child labor. This is not good. It's a sin. But this is a help. This is assistance. Let's say, for example, asking for the water, fetching for the water, doing small things. It's like coming together and helping family in earning livelihood. So this cannot be excluded. So this is what problem I noticed in RTE Act. However, like this is a wonderful act. It talks about free and compulsory education. So this is a very significant step that was taken. Right? Let's look at the next slide, please. Right of Person with Disability Act of 2016. It further strengthened the commitment to inclusive education by mandating that children with disabilities should be integrated into regular school unless the severity of their disability necessitates otherwise. The act requires all educational institutions to provide inclusive education, make campuses accessible, train educators to support special needs students, and ensure non-discrimination in admission process. Let me talk one by one here. What does it require? This act, Right of Person with Disability Act, came in 2016. Inclusive education, make campuses accessible, all right. Training educator to support special needs students, ensuring non-discrimination in admission process, all right. So these are the things, like you have to train educator to support special needs, like I was talking about this, and then also ensuring non-discrimination. National Education Policy, right? This was Act 2016. Now we are talking about 2020, which means 4 years before. Is a progressive document that aspires to overhaul the Indian education system by incorporating a more inclusive and accessible structure for people with disabilities, for students with disabilities. NEP emphasizes barrier-free access, utilization of assistive technologies, teacher training in inclusive education practices, and partnership with non-governmental organization to implement inclusive education at the grassroots level, right? So this NEP emphasizes barrier-free access, utilization of assistive technologies, teacher training, inclusive education practices, and partnership with non-governmental organization to implement inclusive education at the grassroots level. So to make inclusive education a reality, India must adopt a multifaceted approach that involves policy reforms, increasing funding, right? Look at this, reforms in terms of policies, funding has to be increased, attitudinal change, which means cultural barriers, and active engagement from civil society. This is very much important, right? Active engagement from civil society. So improving infrastructure and accessibility, the government should prioritize the development of accessible infrastructure in all schools. So this include ramps, this include elevators, this include accessible toilets and assistive technologies. Urban areas may serve as a pilot zones for implementing model schools with full accessibility, creating templates for rural areas. And then we also talking about teacher training program, where one has to establish a mandatory curriculum, which is a component on disability education within teacher training program. That is essential. We also need regular workshop on teaching strategies, early detection of disabilities, inclusive pedagogy, that's very important, that can equip educators to support diverse learning needs. Collaboration with NGOs, international agencies specializing in inclusive education may provide additional expertise and resources, right? So when I'm talking about, like, this one important thing that we need to discuss here is about inclusive pedagogy, right? So what is inclusive pedagogy, right? What is inclusive pedagogy? Inclusive pedagogy means how you are teaching students. What if your teaching is governed by the ableist assumptions? What if your teaching is motivated, led by ableist assumptions? Because ableist assumption also can be noticed in the classrooms, right? For example, when I teach plays, I also ask some questions that how the narrator is writing, what are the characters are doing, how do you look at these characters? Because our students is also coming from a background who carry that assumption, right? Who carry that assumption, and if they carry that assumption, one has to challenge that assumption, because one has to sensitize this. You have to sensitize the people. Hey, look, no, this is more governed by ableism. So that's why I said read it's just my book, so I don't want to promote here, but the good book, like this is a book called The Lexicon of Disability Studies, where accessibility, ableism has discussed in details. So when you look at these concepts, this is important. In pedagogy has to be different, it has to be new, it has to be fresh. It does not have to be coming from a dominant culture, dominant thinking pattern. That's why there is a very good book, and I would suggest you to read the Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. All right. So look at the slide, please. So in the slide, I'm talking about creating community awareness. Public awareness campaigns are crucial in reshaping societal attitudes toward disability. Educating communities about the value of inclusive education can elevate some of the stigma associated with disabilities. Inclusion ambassadors who share success stories of persons with disabilities could help shift societal perception and encourage family to send the children with disabilities to school, right? So public-private partnership. So public-private partnership can be instrumental in funding and implementing inclusive education. So corporate social responsibilities, which means CSR initiative, coupled with government schemes, can help finance infrastructure, training, the purchase of assistive devices. NGOs can contribute significantly by working on ground level interventions, particularly in rural and unserved areas, right? So then we have leveraging technologies. Leveraging technology, which means technology has the potential to revolutionize inclusive education, accessible digital content, text-to-speech software. So I'm talking about more computer technologies, right? Online learning platform that can create personalized learning experience for a student with disability. So the government should focus on expanding digital literacy and access in both urban and rural setting, using technologies as a tool for inclusion, right? So inclusive education in India is a work in progress, requiring a collective commitment from the government, educators, civil societies, and community at large. So education is not, understand this, education is not just right, but a catalyst for empowerment and social integration. By investing in inclusive educational practices, right? By talking about inclusive educational practices, India can empower, right? It can build up millions of people with disabilities to contribute meaningfully to society, fulfilling their potential, enhancing social equity, So as the country strives to meet the sustainable development goal and create a more inclusive society, ensuring accessible, equitable, quality education for all must remain at the forefront of India's development agenda, right? So what I'm trying to tell you here, that education one is a very important area where one has to work to include people with disabilities. Education is not only important in sense of including people with disabilities, but it also important in challenging the attitudes and behavior and the approaches of people without disability towards people with disabilities. So education space is where holistic development is possible, where they can learn new things, where they can learn new programs, awareness programs and all. And I say this very clearly that disability studies is more for people without disabilities, because sensitivity is important, sensitization is very important. One has to be very sensitive towards society, to people, despite any differences, despite any caste, culture, community, cuisine, right? Until and unless they are, we are not going to build an inclusive space for everyone. How is it possible? It's only possible when we take enough measures initially. Technology is obviously very significant and important for education. Training program is very important, right? Along with the training program, we have to have pedagogies, how you are going to teach. Because so far you have been teaching to people without disability, but now in the classroom you have people with disabilities, how you are going to teach that? It's not simple, it's difficult. People must be trained for inclusive pedagogies. The kind of education they need, the kind of work need to be implemented. You understand what I'm suggesting, right? So what are the texts that you are introducing? What are the curriculum you have framed, syllabus designed? It has to be redesigned by keeping in mind people with disabilities. Let's say, for example, in our Banaras Hindu University, after we implemented NEP, we have introduced one course on disability and literature at the preliminary level, which means be a first semester student are going to read that, because important at the very beginning level, they must be introduced to this kind of courses. With this, I would like to end my lecture and would say thank you so much for listening to me. Take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.